Hello and welcome back to DLC. I'm your host today, Joey Fitz, and today we're looking at a game called Skelethrone, the Chronicles of Ericonia. I'm just going to be calling it Skelethrone from here on out because it's much easier to say and it's quite a long title. Before we get into the episode, I'd like to thank our friends over at Game.Press and 70 Strike for providing us with a free review copy of the game. In this episode, I'm going to cover my impressions of the game, start to finish, what I liked, what could be a little bit better, and whether I'd recommend this to you. Overall, I came away with a pretty positive review, but it wasn't a flawless experience, especially in the early hours. But I'll explain more in the episode. Let's get into it. To set the stage, Skelethrone is a 2D action platformer with heavy Souls-like Metroidvania influences. It's developed by 70 Strike and published via Valkyrie Initiative. It was released in August 2024 and it has mostly positive reviews from its players. In Skelethrone, you play as Derek Ericonia in skeletal form. Waking up in a hostile, monster-filled world, you collect essence from defeated foes, you risk losing it in death, and you must journey through interconnected zone, fight challenging bosses, upgrade your weapons and stats, and make choices that influence the story's outcome. The game leads hard into that atmosphere. It's got bleak environments, traps, exploration, high-stakes combat. Many reviewers have likened it to a 2D Dark Souls with a couple of rough edges. So that's a skeleton of the game, pun intended. Now, how did it actually play? Well, my first few hours in Skelethrone were challenging to say the least. The opening feels very punishing. Enemies hit hard and I died very often. The lack of strong weapons or upgrades early on made my first encounters feel very much like a grind. I think part of that is intentional. The game wants you to feel vulnerability, progress carefully and be cautious, but there's a balance to strike, and in my case, I felt it leaned just a bit too far toward difficulty early on. In some moments I wondered if I was just trudging through rather than having fun. I remember one section where I kept getting one-shot by enemies that I thought I should have outpaced. In the same area, there were hazards blended too well into the background, causing surprise deaths, and it felt a little bit cheap at times. It was quite frustrating and they showed up more than once. I've seen elsewhere that other reviews have flagged clunky hitboxes or dodgy controls in early sections, but I'm really pleased to say that I didn't have this. Graphically and atmospherically, though, it made a really good impression. The somber environments, oppressive lighting and gothic touches made me want to push forward. But until I got a few upgrades under my belt, progression was very slow and difficulty felt occasionally unbalanced. So the early hours are tough. If you try Skelethrone, I caution a new player to stick with it for the first grind hump, but the payoff is well worth it if you have the patience. This is how it evolved. Once I unlocked better weapons and started putting points into my upgrades, the experience improved significantly. The mid-game is where I think Skelethrone finds more of its identity and groove. I began to experiment more. I was able to switch weapon types and think about my stat allocation more thoughtfully. I was able to revisit earlier zones with new mobility and tools, and this opened up new paths, secret areas and shortcuts which felt really satisfying. The sense of I can go back to the area where I struggled in initially and explore further now is core to the Metroidvania experience. And I think that Skelethrone took this non-linear structure and made it much more rewarding later in the game rather than at the beginning. I think the mid-game is where the game shone. You felt much more open to explore yourself, and you felt like you were formidable enemies to the multiple foes that you came across in this really pretty world. There was one point in the mid-game section where I got forced into a boss gauntlet. So that's a series of bosses in quick succession in a fixed arena. And it felt like it disrupted the exploratory flow. It felt a little bit jarring, and it felt like the game had suddenly changed its rules for no strong reason or payoff. This is the one section that I really struggled with in the mid-section of the game. Still, with the overall improvements to gear, mobility and exploration brought the fun factor up considerably. The tension, risk of death, and returning to your essence All of these ingredients made Skelethrone work in its mid to late game segments. So the bits that I think Skelethrone did really, really well: the atmosphere and the art direction. I think the levels are imaginative. I think each area has personality, and they often feel dangerous in a meaningful way, not just visually foreboding. The mood and world building really shine here. The risk and reward loop. Losing essence on death and needing to recover it is a central mechanic to any Souls-like game. But the cycle gives weight to each escape, each boss attempt, and each cautious move. Souls-like fans will find this very familiar, but in 2D, it adds enough of a twist to it to give it a punch. The upgrades and build variety were another highlight. Over time, being able to invest in stats and unlocking passive skills meant that helping choose your weapon types added depth and encouraged experimentation within the game. I've said that the world building is great, but what was really fun about it was the ability to backtrack with your improved abilities and find loads of hidden paths. This world feels very interconnected. It's not an easy thing to do in games, and revisiting previous zones gave you a real sense of reward. It was very satisfying, and it's one of the more gratifying aspects when you're playing through the early slog of the game. Finally, with every Souls-like, one of the biggest things you'll be asked is, how were the bosses? Some bosses were genuinely tough and very clever, rewarding patience and learning patterns rather than aggression. When everything clicks in the mid to late game, your timing, your gear and your observations, these fights felt like you earned your victory. And the highlights of the game kept me engaged, which made me glad that I hadn't quit early. Skelethrone was most compelling when it was testing your limits, but also handing you some tools to overcome them. Of course, no game is perfect, and I've implied this with the review so far. Here's a few things that I experienced. The early game was a grind and a very steep learning curve. I think it was about the first hour or two felt overly punishing, and it was really slow to get the rewards you needed to feel powerful enough to survive in the world. If you stick with it, the game improves, but that barrier is difficult to get over. The writing and the story structure are among the weaker elements of the game. The plot is often vague, but not in a Dark Souls way. The characters are often name-dropped with very little context, and some dialogue feels tonally off from the rest of the game. Also, that aforementioned boss gauntlet felt like an odd detour and breaks the pacing of the game. The game generally flows well, but that mid-game arena segment felt like a departure from its core design. And it's as though the game forces boss fights for the sake of quantity, disrupting the balance, or the Dark Souls 2 effect. So, my final thoughts on Skelethrone. If you enjoy Dark Souls, Hollow Knight, or Blasphemous, Skelethrone may well appeal to you, even though it's a little bit more rough than these. It felt a little bit imperfect, but compelling enough to push through the rough start, and then I saw comparisons to Blasphemous, Salty Sanctuary, and Last Faith later on in the game. So where do I land? Skelethrone comes with a strong recommend with caveats. If you go in expecting a completely polished experience, you'll likely find things to complain about, as I have done today. But if you enjoy difficult games and don't mind some roughness, and are willing to stick out past the early grind, there's something rewarding here. I think it did the atmosphere, exploration, and risk and reward loops great, but stumbled a little bit in the difficulty curve, pacing in parts, and the narrative. Right, so that wraps up my review of Skelethrone. Once again, thank you to our friends 70 Stripe for the review copy of the game and our friends over at Game.Press. If you've heard of Skelethrone or you've seen it on Steam and you wanted to check it out, I hope this review gave you a little bit of direction. If you've played it, let us know in our Discord. And make sure you follow us on all the social medias at Game Club Pod. As I said, I've been Joey. This has been DLC. And I hope you have a great day.